She would remember the ceiling. Not the way it looked before the vaulted observation gallery of the Orvinthy passenger liner Gentle Threshold, all polished nacre panels and bioluminescent guide strips, and the soft blue planet light of Surith Prime filtering through 3 tiers of transparent composite overhead. She would remember it the way it looked after, when the ceiling became the floor and the floor became the ceiling, and the guide strips that had pointed toward the promenade now pointed toward the bilge. Thessie Renkali would remember the moment her daughter stopped screaming. Not because Vale was calm, because the child's lungs had run dry. Because a 4-year-old Orvinthy girl had exhausted every frequency her vocal cords could produce, and what replaced the screaming was worse, a thin, hitching silence. The sound of a small body that had decided the universe was no longer a place where crying accomplished anything. That was the ceiling Thessie would remember, the one she was staring at now, in this moment, with Vale's claws hooked into the fabric of her travel coat, and the emergency lighting turning everything the color of rust. This is how it started. 14 hours earlier, the Gentle Threshold was the finest passenger liner on the Surith to Kolvari transit corridor. 1,100 passengers, a crew of 260. 18 decks of staterooms, recreation halls, dining galleries, an observation promenade that wrapped the ship's dorsal spine like a glass ribbon, and a command bridge staffed by officers of the Orvinthy Maritime Transit Authority whose uniforms were pressed and whose watch rotations were published 6 months in advance. Thessie Renkali boarded at Dock 7 on Surith Prime with her daughter balanced on one hip and a transit case in the other hand. The case held clothing, Vale's sleep shell, 3 containers of pureed keltha fruit that Vale would eat and nothing else, and a datapad loaded with 30 hours of children's programming that Thessie had curated with the desperate precision of a parent facing 9 days in a stateroom with a 4-year-old. She was not wealthy. The ticket was subsidized. The Maritime Transit Authority offered reduced fares for single-parent families relocating under the Kolvari Resettlement Initiative. Thessie was relocating because her bonded partner had died 8 months ago in an industrial accident at the Surith Prime Atmospheric Processing Plant, and the grief counselor assigned to her case had suggested that a change of environment might help Vale stop asking when her father was coming home. Thessie had not told the grief counselor that she had stopped answering that question 3 months ago. She had not told anyone. She simply packed the transit case and boarded the ship and found stateroom 714 on deck 7, and set up Vale's sleep shell and cued the first episode of a children's program about a small marine creature who explored tide pools, and she sat on the edge of the bunk and breathed. The Gentle Threshold departed on schedule. The first 6 hours were unremarkable. Thessie fed Vale. Vale ate half the keltha fruit and smeared the other half on the stateroom wall. Thessie cleaned the wall. She took Vale to the observation promenade on the dorsal spine, and they stood at the viewport and watched the stars not moving. Not really, not at any speed the eye could detect, but Vale pressed her face against the glass and said, "Mama, the stars are going home too." And Thessie did not correct her because the sentence was better than anything a grief counselor had ever produced. They ate dinner in the communal gallery. The food was adequate processed keltha stew, a vegetable broth, a small sweet roll that Vale dismantled with surgical precision and ate only the inside of. An older passenger at the next table, the man Thessie would later know as Orn, smiled at Vale and offered her a piece of dried fruit from a cloth bag. Vale took it. She ate it. She did not say thank you because she was 4, and 4-year-olds took the world as it came. Vale fell asleep in the sleep shell at the 6th hour. Thessie sat in the dark and listened to the ship's engines, a low, steady hum that vibrated through the deck plates and into her bones, the sound of 1,100 people being carried somewhere they had chosen to go. She thought about Kolvari. She thought about the apartment that the resettlement office had assigned her, a 2-room unit in a housing block near the atmospheric processing plant, where she had already been offered a position in the cafeteria. She thought about whether Vale would stop asking about her father, once they were in a place where no corner of the room reminded the child that someone was missing. She did not think about the distress beacon on the ship's dorsal spine. She did not know it existed. At the 7th hour, the ship hit the gravity wake. Later, the Maritime Transit Authority's investigation would determine that the gravity wake was caused by the unscheduled collapse of a navigational buoy in the Varathi Shoals, a region of compressed gravitational fields that the Surathakalvari corridor skirted by a margin of 47 kilometers. The buoy's collapse shifted the nearest gravitational shear by 11 kilometers. The corridor's margin shrank from 47 kilometers to 36. The gentle threshold, traveling at standard transit speed on a heading calculated for a 47-kilometer margin, crossed into the edge of the shear. The effect was instantaneous. The gravitational differential across the ship's hull exceeded the inertial dampener's rated tolerance by a factor of 3. The portside dampeners failed first, then the ventral array, then the dorsal. In 0.4 of a second, the ship experienced a rotational force that the investigation would later describe as equivalent to the vessel being gripped and inverted by an external agency. The gentle threshold rolled. Thessie was in the corridor outside stateroom 714 when it happened. She was carrying Vale in one arm and a container of keltha fruit in the other, walking toward the communal dining gallery on deck 6, and the universe came apart. The floor tilted, not gradually, not a list, not a lean, it swung. The corridor became a chute. Thessie's feet left the deck and she was falling sideways, then upward, then sideways again, and she wrapped both arms around Vale and pulled the child against her chest and tucked her own head down and hit something, a wall, a door frame, the edge of a service conduit with her left shoulder. The keltha fruit container shattered. The emergency lighting activated. The gravity, when it reasserted, was wrong. It pulled her toward what had been the ceiling. She landed on the ceiling. The nacre panels cracked under her weight. The bioluminescent guide strips, designed to point forward along the corridor, now pointed straight up toward the floor above her, which was now below her, which was the deck she had been walking on 3 seconds ago. Vale screamed. Thessie held her. She held her and did not let go and did not look at anything except the child's face and said the words that parents say when the universe has stopped making sense, and the only tool left is the sound of a voice that the child recognizes. She said, "I have you, I have you, I have you." The emergency klaxon sounded. 3 short blasts, 2 long, 1 short, the Orventhi maritime code for catastrophic structural event. All passengers shelter in place. Thessie did not know where in place was. She was on the ceiling of a corridor that no longer had a functional orientation. The lighting was the color of rust. The air smelled of ruptured coolant lines and scorched insulation, and something else, something organic, something that Thessie's hindbrain identified before her conscious mind could form the word. Blood. She looked down up along the inverted corridor. 20 meters away, a passenger was pinned beneath a section of deck plating that had buckled inward during the roll. The passenger was Orventhi, older, male, wearing the blue-gray of a retired civil servant. He was not moving. Thessie looked away. She pressed Vale's face against her shoulder so the child could not see. "Mama," Vale said. The screaming had stopped. The thin silence had begun. "Mama, the floor is wrong." "I know, little one. We're going to find the right floor." She did not know if there was a right floor. She did not know if any part of this ship was still right. But a 4-year-old needed a destination, and find the right floor was a destination, and that was enough. 12 hours before the gentle threshold departed Surath Prime, a maintenance technician named Goran Vault had performed the quarterly inspection of the ship's emergency systems. He had tested the fire suppression on all 18 decks. He had verified the pressure seals on the lifeboat bays. He had checked the medical supplies in the emergency stations. And he had, as required by Maritime Transit Authority Regulation 471, tested the ship's external distress beacon. The distress beacon was a standard-issue Orventhy maritime unit, a high-power transmitter housed in a reinforced pod on the ship's dorsal spine, designed to activate automatically in the event of catastrophic structural failure, and broadcast a compressed SOS on the Orventhy maritime emergency frequency. The signal would reach Surith Prime's Maritime Coordination Center within minutes, and a rescue flotilla would be dispatched. Goran Vault tested it. The beacon responded. He logged the test and moved on. What Goran Vault did not test, because he did not know it existed, was the secondary circuit board installed inside the beacon housing during the ship's last refit at the Molvari orbital yards, 14 months earlier. The circuit board had been added as part of a contractual obligation under the Interspecies Emergency Compact. Article 88, a mutual aid agreement signed between the Orventhy Maritime Transit Authority and 7 other species emergency response networks 22 years ago. The compact required all signatory vessels above a certain tonnage to carry a secondary distress transmitter that would broadcast simultaneously on a shared multi-species emergency frequency in the event of catastrophic failure. The Orventhy Maritime Transit Authority had signed the compact. They had complied with the refit requirement. They had not, in the 22 years since, thought about it again. Article 88 was a bureaucratic footnote, a diplomatic courtesy extended during a period of interspecies goodwill that had since cooled. The secondary circuit board sat inside the beacon housing, dormant, waiting, connected to a frequency that the Orventhy Maritime Coordination Center did not monitor because they had never needed to. The shared multi-species emergency frequency was monitored by 12 species emergency networks. One of those species was human. Thessie moved through the inverted ship with Vale on her back. The child had gone quiet, not the thin silence of exhaustion, but the focused stillness of a 4-year-old who had decided to concentrate on the task of gripping her mother's shoulders. Vale's claws dug through the fabric of Thessie's travel coat and into the skin beneath, and Thessie let them. Pain was a small thing. Direction was the large thing. The gentle threshold had not simply inverted. The gravitational shear had twisted the ship along its longitudinal axis, which meant the geometry of the interior was no longer consistent. Some corridors were upside down. Some were tilted at 45 degrees. Some had buckled entirely, their walls compressed together by the torsional forces, creating impassable knots of metal and shattered composite. Thessie was not an engineer. She was a food service worker who had spent 11 years ladling keltha stew in the employee cafeteria of the Surith Prime atmospheric processing plant. She did not know the physics of torsional stress. What she knew was that water was accumulating in the corridors. The gentle threshold carried 12,000 cubic meters of potable water in reservoirs distributed across its lower decks that were now upper decks, which meant the reservoirs were above her, and the water was coming down. It seeped through ruptured pipes and cracked deck seams and pooled in the inverted corridors, rising slowly, coldly, inexorably. On Deck 7 now, the uppermost accessible deck in this section of the ship, the water was ankle-deep. On Deck 8 below, above, whatever direction, toward the hull, it would be deeper. Thessie needed to go down, toward the hull. Toward the lifeboats, which were housed in bays along the ship's ventral surface, which was now the top of the ship, which meant the lifeboats were above her, and the only way to reach them was to descend through the inverted decks, through the rising water, toward the bottom of a ship that was now the top. She carried Vale and she moved. The first other survivor she found was a ship's steward named Pelham, a thin Orventhy male with trembling hands, and a gash across his forehead that he kept touching and looking at his fingers as though the blood were someone else's. Pelham was standing in the intersection of 2 inverted corridors on Deck 8, knee-deep in water, staring at a service hatch that had been sealed by the emergency lockdown protocols. "It won't open," he said when Thessie reached him. "The emergency seals engaged when the ship rolled. Every watertight hatch below Deck 6 is locked. There has to be a manual override." "There is. The override panel is on the other side." Thessie looked at the sealed hatch. She looked at the water around her knees. She looked at Vale, who was gripping her shoulders and breathing against the back of her neck. "Then we go another way." "There is no other way. This section's only vertical access shaft is through this hatch." Thessie turned and walked back the way she had come. Pelham stood in the water and stared after her, and after 4 seconds he followed. He followed because she was moving, and in the absence of any other direction, movement was enough. She found the maintenance crawlway on the port side of Deck 8, a narrow service tunnel that ran between the hull plating and the corridor walls, used by technicians for cable routing and pipe inspection. The access panel was a meter above the waterline. She pried it open with her fingers, tearing 2 of her claw tips in the process, and looked inside. The crawlway was barely wide enough for an adult Orvinthy. It was pitch dark. It ran vertically downward toward the hull, which was up, which was where the lifeboats were. "I can't," Pelham said. "Then stay." Thessie put Vale into the crawlway first, wedging the child into the narrow space and telling her to hold on to the cable brackets. Then she climbed in after her. She heard Pelham's breathing behind her, ragged, wet, panicked, and then she heard him climb in too. They descended, or ascended. The distinction had stopped mattering. The crawlway was worse than Thessie had imagined. The cable brackets were slick with condensation, and the space between the walls pressed against her shoulders and hips with a constant, claustrophobic pressure that made every breath feel earned. Vale was wedged between Thessie's chest and the tunnel wall, the child's arms locked around her mother's neck, her face buried in Thessie's collar. Above them, below them, Pelham's breathing echoed in the narrow space, a ragged metronome that counted off the distance. They passed through a section where the crawlway crossed a ruptured water line. The water fell in a steady curtain across the tunnel, cold enough to make Thessie's scales contract involuntarily, and she heard Vale gasp, a small, sharp intake of breath that was the loudest sound the child had made in an hour. She pressed the child closer and moved through the curtain and kept climbing. At the junction between decks 9 and 10, the crawlway opened into a wider maintenance bay, a space meant for storing replacement cable spools and pipe fittings, now inverted and half-flooded. 2 other survivors were already there. An Orvinthy woman in the uniform of a ship's purser, bleeding from a cut along her jaw, and beside her a young male, barely past his adolescent molt, holding a sealed emergency kit he had pulled from a bulkhead station. The purser's name was Colossi. She had been on Deck 3 when the ship rolled. She had fallen 4 decks through a ruptured stairwell and walked away with nothing but the jaw wound and a conviction that the universe owed her an explanation. "The main vertical shaft is flooded from Deck 6 down," Colossi said. "I came through the service tunnels. Everything below Deck 10 is filling fast. The bilge pumps are on the wrong side of the ship. They're pumping air instead of water." Thessie absorbed this. The bilge pumps were designed to remove water from the lowest point of the ship. The lowest point of the ship was now the highest point. The pumps were running in reverse, cycling uselessly, spending the last of the emergency power to pump nothing. "How long until the water reaches this level?" Colossi looked at the water lapping at the edges of the maintenance bay. 2 hours, maybe less, depends on how many more pipes crack. 2 hours. Thessie looked at Vale. The child looked back at her with eyes that were too large and too steady for a 4-year-old, the eyes of a child who had learned, in the space of a single afternoon, that the universe was a place where the floor could become the ceiling, and the only constant was the grip of her mother's arms. "Then we keep moving down," Thessie said. The distress beacon on the gentle threshold's dorsal spine activated 41 seconds after the ship rolled. The primary circuit fired its signal towards Surith Prime on the Orventhi Maritime Emergency Frequency, as designed. The Maritime Coordination Center received it. They logged it. They began assembling a rescue flotilla. The secondary circuit board the one Goran Vault did not know existed, the one installed under Article 88 of the Interspecies Emergency Compact, fired its signal simultaneously on the shared multi-species frequency. The signal traveled outward at the speed of light plus through the relay network. It reached the Orventhi Maritime Coordination Center and was ignored. They were already working the primary signal. It reached the Selvari Emergency Response Authority, who logged it and noted that it was outside their operational range. It reached the Drevani Commerce Authority, who acknowledged it and filed a jurisdictional deferral. It reached the Cathari Fleet Command, who noted it with formal condolences and no ships available. It reached Terran Emergency Monitoring Station 14, a small crewed relay platform orbiting a brown dwarf in the Varathi border region, at 7 minutes and 43 seconds after activation. Monitoring Station 14 was staffed by 3 people. Petty Officer 2nd Class Aaron Wynn was on watch. He was 26 years old, from a town in the Pacific Northwest that he described to anyone who asked as the kind of place where it rains 11 months a year, and the 12th month it just hasn't stopped yet. He had been assigned to Monitoring Station 14 for 9 months. In those 9 months, he had received 4,612 routine signals, 19 navigational advisories, 2 weather warnings, and 0 distress calls. He received one now. The signal came in on the multi-species emergency frequency, a frequency that Aaron monitored as part of the Interspecies Emergency Compact, Article 88, a document he had read exactly once during his training and remembered primarily because his instructor had said, "You will probably never hear anything on this frequency, but if you do, you will be very busy for the next several hours." Aaron read the signal. He read it again. He cross-referenced the vessel registry. The Gentle Threshold, Orventhi passenger liner, 1,100 passengers, 260 crew. Catastrophic structural failure. Position: deep inside the Varathi Shoals, 47 kilometers off the Surith-Kolvari corridor. He opened the response protocol for Article 88 multi-species distress calls. Step 1. Confirm the signal is genuine. Confirm the beacon's authentication codes match the Compact's registry. Step 2. Determine if the originating species-owned rescue assets are responding. He checked the Orventhi Maritime Coordination Center's broadcast channel. They were responding. They had dispatched a flotilla. Estimated arrival, 19 hours. 19 hours. Aaron looked at the passenger count, 1,100. He looked at the damage assessment embedded in the distress beacon's telemetry. Catastrophic structural failure. Hull integrity compromised on 12 of 18 decks. Reactor offline. Life support on emergency backup with an estimated 6-hour reserve. 6 hours of life support. 19 hours until the Orventhi flotilla arrived. Step 3 of the Article 88 response protocol. If the originating species rescue assets cannot arrive within the distress vessel's survivable window, notify the nearest signatory responder with assets in range. Aaron knew who the nearest signatory responder was. He was sitting in it. He opened a channel to Terran Combined Fleet Operations, Varathi Sector Command. Ops, this is Monitoring Station 14. I have a multi-species Article 88 distress activation. Orventhi passenger liner Gentle Threshold, 1,100 souls aboard, catastrophic structural failure in the Varathi Shoals. Originating rescue assets are 19 hours out. Vessel life support is 6 hours. Requesting immediate Terran response. The reply came in 90 seconds, not from Sector Command. From the TFS Resolute, a Terran heavy cruiser on patrol in the Varathi border region, whose communications officer had been monitoring the sector frequency and heard Aaron's transmission. Monitoring 14, this is TFS Resolute. We copy your Article 88 activation. We are 4 hours, 12 minutes from the distress coordinates at maximum sustainable speed. Altering course. Resolute is responding. 4 hours and 12 minutes, inside the window, barely. Aaron sat back in his chair. Then the second call came. TFS Kessler, a destroyer escort, 2 hours behind the Resolute. Then the third. TFS Avery March, a fleet tender carrying medical supplies and emergency habitat modules, 5 hours out but coming anyway. Then Sector Command responded, not with one ship, with a coordination order. All Terran vessels within 8-hour transit of the following coordinates are directed to respond to Article 88 distress activation, authorization code 77 Bravo. This is a mass casualty passenger vessel event. Full humanitarian response package authorized. Medical, engineering, search and rescue, and emergency habitat assets are to converge on the distress coordinates. Sector Command is assuming coordination authority under Compact Article 88, Section 4. Aaron counted the acknowledgments as they came in. The Resolute, the Kessler, the Avery March, a frigate, the TFS Dunaway, a search and rescue cutter, the TFS Pell, a hospital ship, the TFS Clement, which was 11 hours away and responded anyway with the single word, inbound. 7 ships, for a distress call that had not been aimed at them, from a species that had not asked for their help, under a compact that the Orventhi Maritime Transit Authority had forgotten it had signed. Aaron's hands were steady on the console. His instructor had been right. He was going to be very busy. Thessie was waist-deep in water when the first rumble came from outside the hull. She had been moving for 3 hours. 3 hours through inverted corridors and maintenance crawlways and shattered staterooms and flooded compartments, always descending toward the hull, toward the lifeboats, toward the direction that her body insisted was down even though every visual cue told her it was up. She had gathered 11 other survivors along the way. Pelham the steward, a retired schoolteacher named Vashti who walked with a limp from a broken ankle and refused to stop. A young couple, newly bonded, who held each other's hands and said nothing. A ship's cook who had been in the galley when the ship rolled and whose face was a mask of burns from the overturned fryers. 2 children, a boy of 12 who had been separated from his parents and a girl of 8 who had been separated from everyone. An elderly passenger named Orn who carried a small cloth bag and would not tell anyone what was inside it. A maintenance technician named Sullen who knew the ship's layout and kept saying, this way, even when he was not certain, because certainty was a luxury and direction was not. And Vale, always Vale, on Thessie's back, claws in her shoulders, breathing against her neck, silent. The water was rising faster now. The reservoirs on the upper decks, the lower decks, the decks above them had fully breached, and the water cascaded down through every crack and seam and ruptured pipe, pooling in the inverted corridors, filling them from the bottom up. The bottom was where Thessie needed to go. The lifeboats were at the bottom. The bottom was filling with water. She was beginning to understand that the lifeboats might already be underwater. On deck 10, they had lost the young bonded couple, not to the water, to a choice. The husband had heard tapping from behind a sealed stateroom door, and when Sullen said the door's emergency bolts could not be opened from outside, the husband had stayed anyway. His wife stayed with him. They were working the bolts with a pry bar fashioned from a broken handrail when Thessie's group moved on. She did not know if they opened the door. She did not know if anyone was alive behind it. She carried the not knowing the way she carried Vale against her chest, heavy, impossible to set down. On deck 11, the cook collapsed. The burns on his face had begun to swell, the tissue around his eyes tightening until he could barely see, and his breathing had taken on a wet rasp that Thessie recognized from the atmospheric processing plant, the sound of fluid in the lungs, the sound of a body turning against itself. Vashti and the 12-year-old boy got him upright. They put his arms over their shoulders and walked him forward, step by step, through water that was at their waists and rising. The emergency lighting failed on deck 11 at the 3-hour mark. The darkness was absolute, not the dimness of a power outage, not the gray of a cloudy night, but the total, lightless black of a sealed space without a single photon. Sullen's hand lamp was the only source. Its beam cut a narrow cone through the dark water, and the 13 of them, 15 once, but 2 had stayed behind, and the number was a wound followed that cone the way a drowning person follows a rope. Tessie recounted. 15 had become 13. She had known the young couple for less than an hour. She did not know their names. She knew only that they had stayed behind a sealed door because someone might have been alive on the other side. And that was the kind of knowing that settled in the chest and did not leave. The rumble came from outside, not the groan of stressed metal. Tessie had learned to recognize that sound over the past 3 hours, the sound of a ship dying by degrees, settling into its ruin like an old building subsiding into soft ground. This was different. This was external, a deep, rhythmic vibration that traveled through the hull plating and into the water and into her bones. "Engines," Sullen said. He was standing beside her in the corridor, inverted deck 12, where the water was at their waists and the emergency lighting had failed, and the only illumination was the pale glow of Sullen's emergency hand lamp. "Those are engines, big ones, not ours." "Whose?" Sullen shook his head. "I don't know, but they're close. That vibration pattern, that's a vessel within a few hundred meters of our hull." The retired schoolteacher, Vashti, was holding the 8-year-old girl on her hip despite the broken ankle. She said, "The Maritime Authority, the rescue flotilla." "Too soon," Sullen said. "The flotilla is 19 hours out. We've been in this for 3, maybe 4. "Then who?" Nobody answered. The vibration continued, a steady, powerful thrum that resonated through the flooded corridors and made the standing water ripple. Then a sound that Tessie did not recognize, a metallic impact against the outer hull, not a collision, not debris, a precise, deliberate contact like a hand pressing flat against a door. Then another. Then a series of rapid, shallow percussions that traveled along the hull plating in a pattern that was too regular to be accidental. Sullen pressed his ear against the nearest bulkhead. His eyes widened. "Someone is cutting into the hull." The TFS Resolute arrived at the coordinates 4 hours and 9 minutes after altering course, 3 minutes ahead of estimate. Captain Elaine Morrow stood on the bridge and looked at the gentle threshold through the forward viewport and said nothing for 7 seconds. The passenger liner was inverted, completely inverted, hanging in the gravitational eddy of the Varathi shoals like a toy dropped in a bathtub. The ship's dorsal spine, the observation promenade, the glass ribbon that had been the vessel's signature architectural feature, was now the lowest point, submerged in a pool of debris and vented atmosphere that had collected in the gravitational low point. The ventral hull, where the lifeboat bays should have been accessible, was now the top, and the bays were sealed, the hull plating buckled by torsional stress, the launch mechanisms jammed, the lifeboats trapped inside the ship they were supposed to save the passengers from. "Assessment," Morrow said. Her executive officer, Commander David Chen, was already reading the damage scan. "Hull integrity compromised on 14 of 18 decks. Reactor is offline. Emergency power is failing. We're reading fluctuating life support output. Estimated depletion in 90 minutes. Internal sensors are down, but thermal imaging shows heat signatures concentrated in the midsection, decks 8 through 12. Water contamination throughout the lower, the upper, the decks closest to the dorsal spine. The ship is flooding from the observation promenade downward. Survivors. Thermal shows approximately 640 distinct heat signatures, scattered, some grouped, some isolated, several in areas already partially flooded. 640 out of 1,360. Morrow did not let the arithmetic show on her face. She would do the subtraction later in private, the way she always did. Begin hull breach operations. I want cutting teams on the hull in 12 minutes. Priority is the largest survivor concentrations first. Get the Kessler on approach for her teams as soon as she arrives. And get me a medical triage zone set up in our forward cargo bay. Clear everything out. I don't care what's in there. The Avery March is 5 hours out with habitat modules and medical supplies. I'm not waiting 5 hours. We work with what we have. Every survivor we can pull before the life support fails is a survivor who lives. Go. Chen hesitated. Captain, there's a complication. The Varathi Shoal's gravitational field is still active. The same shear that rolled the liner is affecting our position. We can hold station, but the margin is narrow. If we extend pressure bridges, they'll be under lateral stress the entire time. One fluctuation in the field and we lose the seal. Then we monitor the field and we work fast. Post a watch on the gravitational sensors. If the shear shifts by more than 2%, sound the recall. Until then, we cut. The Resolute's search and rescue teams deployed in 11 minutes, 1 minute ahead of the captain's deadline. They wore hardened EVA suits rated for zero atmosphere and structural collapse environments. They carried plasma cutters, hydraulic spreaders, portable atmosphere generators, and medical kits. They crossed the gap between the Resolute and the gentle threshold on maneuvering lines, landed on the inverted hull, and began cutting. The first team breached the hull on deck 14, a section near the stern where thermal imaging showed 42 heat signatures clustered in what appeared to be a recreation hall. The breach took 7 minutes. When the hull section came free, water poured out a sudden torrent that knocked the lead cutter back against his safety line. Behind the water, in a pocket of breathable air that was shrinking by the minute, 42 Orventhi passengers were standing on the inverted ceiling of the recreation hall with the water at their chests. The second team breached deck 12 amidships Thessie section, though neither Thessie nor anyone on the Resolute's bridge would make that connection until later. Thessie heard the cutting before she understood it. The sound was different from anything the ship had produced in its death, not the groan of fatigued metal, not the crack of a seam giving way, not the gurgle of water finding a new path. This was a controlled, deliberate hiss, the sound of metal being parted by something that knew exactly where to part it. The hiss traveled along the hull in a straight line, paused, moved at a right angle, paused again, and continued. They were cutting a door. Sullen had herded the group toward the sound. 13 of them now, standing in water that reached Thessie's chest, gathered in a corridor on deck 11 where the hull was close enough to touch. Vale was on Thessie's shoulders, the child's legs locked around her mother's neck, her claws gripping Thessie's crest. The water was cold. The emergency lighting had failed entirely in this section, and Sullen's hand lamp was the only light, a pale cone that turned the water's surface into a mirror, and the faces around Thessie into masks of shadow and exhaustion. The cutting stopped, a moment of silence, then a deep, resonant thud, the sound of a hull section being pushed inward, and light flooded the corridor. Not emergency lighting, not the rust-colored glow of backup power. Real light. White, clean, impossibly bright. The kind of light that belonged to a world where power systems worked and corridors were right side up, and the ceiling was where the ceiling was supposed to be. A figure stood in the opening. Thessie could not see clearly. The light was behind the figure, turning it into a silhouette, but the shape was wrong. Wrong proportions. Too tall in the torso, too narrow in the shoulders, the helmet too round, the suit too bulky. Not Orventhi. The figure stepped through the opening and into the water which came up to its thighs. It swept a handheld light across the group, across Pelham's terrified face, across Vashti holding the 8-year-old girl, across the young bonded couple, across the cook with the burned face, across old Orn clutching his cloth bag, across Sullen with his hand lamp, across Thessie. Across Vale. The figure stopped the light on Vale for half a second. Then it moved the light away deliberately, carefully, the way someone moves a light away from a child's eyes because they have thought about it, because it has occurred to them that a child who has been in the dark for hours does not need a bright light in her face. The figure spoke. The voice was filtered through the helmet, translated through an external speaker that buzzed slightly on the consonants. The language was Orventhi accented, formal, the kind of Orventhi that someone had learned from a textbook rather than from Orventhi people. I am Petty Officer Reese, Terran Combined Fleet Search and Rescue. We are here to get you out. How many in your group? Thessie stared. Terran, the word landed in her mind and did not find a place to sit. Terran, human. The species from the inner systems, the ones the Maritime Transit Authority mentioned in quarterly regulatory updates, the ones who had signed a compact 22 years ago that Thessie had never heard of, and that had nothing to do with her life or her daughter or her dead partner or her subsidized transit ticket or the kelth of fruit smeared on the stateroom wall. 13, Sullen said, his voice cracked on the number. 13, including 2 children. The figure Reese nodded. The helmet made the gesture look mechanical. Copy, 13, 2 children. We have a pressure bridge extending from our ship to this hull section. We're going to move you through the opening and across to our vessel. The children go first. A pause. Is anyone injured? The cook, Sullen said, burns. And the schoolteacher has a broken ankle. Copy, burns and broken ankle. Reese turned and spoke into a comm unit on the suit's collar. The words were in a language Thessie did not understand, clipped, efficient, full of consonants. Then Reese turned back. Medical team is standing by on our side. Let's move. Children first. Thessie did not move. She stood in the water with Vale on her shoulders and looked at the figure in the white light and tried to understand the sequence of events that had produced this moment. She had boarded a passenger liner. The liner had rolled. She had spent 4 hours moving through the wreckage with her daughter on her back, descending through flooded corridors toward lifeboats she was no longer sure existed. And now, a human, a Terran, was standing in a hole cut into the hull, offering to take her child across a pressure bridge to a ship that should not be here, that had no reason to be here, that had come because of a signal that the Orventhi Maritime Transit Authority had sent to its own coordination center on its own frequency for its own rescue flotilla. We didn't call you, she said. The words came out before she could stop them. They were not an accusation. They were not ingratitude. They were the raw, unprocessed fact of the situation, the procedural truth that her mind had reached for because procedural truth was the only solid ground left in a universe where the floor was the ceiling. Reese looked at her. The helmet visor was reflective, and Thessie could see her own face in it, gaunt, wet, her crest flattened against her skull, her eyes too wide. She looked like a person who had been carrying a child through a drowning ship for 4 hours. She looked like exactly what she was. No, ma'am, Reese said. You didn't, but we heard you anyway. Then Reese held out both hands, not reaching for Vale, not grabbing, just offering, palms up, the way someone offers to hold something precious when the person carrying it is too tired to carry it anymore. Thessie looked at those hands, human hands, 5 fingers, no claws, the skin hidden inside the suit's gloves, but the gesture unmistakable, palms up, waiting. Vale moved first. The child loosened her grip on Thessie's crest and leaned forward, leaned toward the stranger in the white light with the round helmet and the wrong proportions, leaned toward the open hands. Not because she understood, because she was 4 years old and the hands were steady, and the light was clean, and the voice had not been loud. Thessie let her go. She lifted Vale from her shoulders and placed the child into Reese's hands, and Reese took her weight without shifting, without fumbling, with the practiced steadiness of someone who had held children before, who had trained for this, who understood that the most important thing about holding a child you have just pulled from a disaster is to hold them as though nothing is wrong. Rhys cradled Vale against the EVA suit's chest plate. The suit was rigid, cold, designed for vacuum operations, and it should have been the least comforting surface in the galaxy. But Vale pressed her face against it and closed her eyes, and her claws, the claws that had been hooked into Thessie's shoulders for 4 hours, drawing blood, holding on, relaxed. Thessie watched her daughter's claws relax, and something inside her chest broke apart and reassembled in a configuration she did not recognize. Not relief. Not yet. Something before relief, the moment when the body understands before the mind catches up that the thing you were carrying is safe. "Follow me," Rhys said. "All of you stay close. The bridge is pressurized and lit. There's warm air on the other side." The pressure bridge was a flexible tunnel extending from the Resolute's portside airlock to the opening Rhys's team had cut into the gentle threshold's hull. It was 3 meters in diameter, lit from within by strips of white LED embedded in the walls, and it hummed with the sound of the air circulator keeping it pressurized. The floor was grated metal, solid, right side up. Right side up. Thessie stepped onto the grated floor and felt the orientation hit her like a physical blow. The floor was beneath her feet. The ceiling was above her head. Gravity pulled downward, toward the floor, the way gravity was supposed to work. After 4 hours in an inverted ship, where every step was a negotiation with a universe that had forgotten which direction things fell, the simple fact of standing on a surface that agreed with gravity made her knees buckle. Pelham caught her arm. The steward's hands were still trembling, but his grip was firm, and he held her upright with the quiet competence of someone who had spent 15 years catching passengers who stumbled on promenade stairs. She walked, they all walked. 13 survivors in a pressurized tunnel, moving toward a ship that had not been called, that had come because a secondary circuit board in a distress beacon. A circuit board installed under a compact nobody remembered, on a frequency nobody monitored, by a species nobody had asked, had fired a signal into the void and found someone listening. On the other side of the pressure bridge was a cargo bay that had been converted into a triage station. The cargo was gone wherever it had been. It had been moved, cleared, shoved aside to make room. In its place were field cots, portable medical stations, stacks of sealed supply cases marked with symbols Thessie could not read, and people. Humans, dozens of them. Moving with the coordinated efficiency of a species that had done this before, not this exactly, not an inverted passenger liner in the Varathi Shoals, but this category of thing, this genre of disaster, this type of moment where people needed to be pulled from wreckage and put back together. They moved without hesitation. They did not stop to stare at the Orventhi survivors. They did not ask unnecessary questions. A medic approached the cook with the burned face, took one look, guided him to a cot, and began treating the burns with a gel that Thessie did not recognize. Another medic knelt in front of Vashti, examined the broken ankle, and began setting it with a portable splint, speaking softly in accented Orventhi the entire time. A third medic, a woman with short dark hair and steady eyes, approached Thessie. She looked at Vale, who was still in Rhys's arms, eyes closed, claws relaxed. "Is this your daughter?" "Yes." "Is she injured?" "I don't know, I don't think so. She stopped talking 2 hours ago." The medic nodded as though she had heard this before, as though children going silent in disasters was a thing she had been trained to expect. She held out her hands, the same gesture Rhys had used, palms up, waiting, and Rhys transferred Vale into the medic's arms with the same practiced steadiness. The medic carried Vale to a cot that had been set up with a smaller mattress, a child-sized mattress, Thessie realized. A mattress that someone had thought to prepare because they had read the passenger manifest and knew there were children aboard, and they had prepared for children. They had planned for children. They had thought about children before they even arrived. The medic set Vale on the mattress and covered her with a thermal blanket that was silver on one side and blue on the other. Vale opened her eyes. She looked at the blanket. She looked at the medic. She looked at the ceiling, the right ceiling, the ceiling that was above her, where ceilings were supposed to be. "Mama," she said, "the floor is right." Thessie sat down on the edge of the cot and held her daughter and did not cry because she was an Orventhi woman who had ladled Keltha stew for 11 years and carried a child through a drowning ship for 4 hours, and she was not the kind of person who cried. She was the kind of person who held. So she held. The Resolute pulled 93 survivors from the gentle threshold before the TFS Kessler arrived 2 hours later with additional cutting teams. The Kessler pulled another 112. Together, through 11 hours of continuous hull breach operations, the two ships extracted 407 survivors from the inverted liner. The TFS Avery March arrived with habitat modules, medical supplies, and a field hospital that was deployed inside the Resolute's secondary cargo bay. The TFS Dunaway ran perimeter patrol to keep debris field traffic away from the rescue zone. The TFS Pell, the search and rescue cutter, sent divers, actual divers, in sealed suits with rebreathers into the flooded sections of the gentle threshold to reach survivors trapped in air pockets on decks that were entirely submerged. The gravitational shear shifted once during the operation, a 2.1% fluctuation that sent a tremor through the pressure bridges and made the Resolute's hull groan. Chen sounded the recall. The cutting teams retracted to the bridges and held. The shear stabilized after 47 seconds. The teams went back. It shifted again 3 hours later, this time a 3% spike. The number 4 pressure bridge lost seal integrity for 11 seconds. No one was crossing it. When the seal re-established, the teams resumed cutting without waiting for the order. Morrow let them. The Pell's divers pulled 61 people from air pockets. 23 of them were children who had been in the ship's nursery on Deck 4 when the ship rolled. The nursery staff, 3 Orventhi women who had barricaded the nursery doors and held the children above the rising water for 6 hours, were pulled out last. One of the nursery staff was unconscious. 2 were hypothermic. All 23 children were alive. The TFS Clement, the hospital ship, arrived 11 hours after the initial response. By then, 609 survivors had been extracted. 41 required intensive medical care. The Clement took them aboard without paperwork, without jurisdictional clearance, without the interspecies medical practice waivers that regulation technically required. "File the waivers later," said the Clement's chief medical officer, a surgeon named Akaffer who had been practicing medicine for 31 years and had long since stopped believing that paperwork should arrive before patients. The cook, the one with the burned face, whose name Thessie had never learned, died on the operating table aboard the Clement. The burns had gone deeper than the field medics could treat, and the fluid in his lungs had been there too long. He died under alien lights, attended by alien surgeons, on a ship that had crossed 11 hours of space to reach him. He was not in the Orventhi Maritime Transit Authority's final report. He was a number in a column. He was one of 751. Thessie learned his name afterward. Pelham told her. The cook's name was Vashan Renthalt, and he had worked in the Gentle Threshold's galley for 9 years, and his specialty had been a sweet Keltha pastry that the passengers requested by name, and Pelham had eaten one every morning of the voyage before the ship rolled. Pelham told her this in the Resolute's cargo bay, sitting on a cot, holding a cup of human broth that had gone cold in his hands. His own hands had stopped trembling. Thessie was not sure when that had happened. Somewhere between the flooded corridors and the pressure bridge, the trembling had stopped, and Pelham had become the kind of person who sat quietly and remembered the dead instead of fearing he would become one. The Orventhi Maritime Coordination Center's rescue flotilla arrived 19 hours and 11 minutes after the distress beacon activated. By then, every living survivor had already been extracted. The Terran ships were still on station. The Resolute's cargo bay was full of Orventhi passengers wrapped in thermal blankets, drinking warm broth from sealed packets that the human crew had heated in their galley. Someone no one would later admit who had found a case of chocolate bars in the Avery March's supplies and distributed them to the children. Vale A2. The Orventhi Flotilla commander, a Maritime Transit Authority Rear Admiral named Dorith Osvalin, docked his flagship with the Resolute and came aboard to assume coordination authority. He was a tall Orventhi with dark purple scales and a uniform that had more insignia than Thessi had ever seen on a single garment. He found Captain Morrow in the cargo bay, standing beside a supply case with a cup of coffee in her hand, watching a human medic teach an Orventhi child how to play a clapping game. "Captain," Dorith said, his Terran standard was formal, precise. "On behalf of the Orventhi Maritime Transit Authority, I wish to express formal gratitude for your response. You arrived before our own assets. You saved lives that we could not have reached in time." He paused. "I must ask, how did you receive the distress signal? We transmitted on the Orventhi Maritime Emergency Frequency. That is not a frequency your vessels monitor." Morrow looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "We didn't receive it on your frequency, Admiral. Your vessel has a secondary distress transmitter installed under the Interspecies Emergency Compact, Article 88. It broadcast on the shared multi-species frequency. Our monitoring station picked it up." Dorith blinked. The involuntary Orventhi expression of confusion, a rapid double flutter of the inner eyelid that the species had never learned to suppress. "Article 88. Yes, sir. We signed that compact 22 years ago." "Yes, sir." It was a diplomatic formality, a courtesy extended during a period of improved relations. "I was not aware that the secondary transmitters had actually been installed." "They were installed, Admiral, on every Orventhi vessel above the tonnage threshold. Your refit yards at Movari did the work 14 months ago. It's in the service records." Dorith stood very still. Thessi watched him from across the cargo bay, watched the rear admiral of the Orventhi Maritime Transit Authority process the fact that a compact he had forgotten, a circuit board he had never known about, and a frequency he did not monitor had saved 609 of his species civilians. "You came because of Article 88, he said. "We came because the signal was genuine, the passenger count was high, and your rescue assets were 19 hours out with 6 hours of life support. Article 88 gave us the legal authority. The math gave us the reason. And the 7 ships, the cruiser, the destroyer, the hospital ship, all of them responded to Article 88. All of them. Sector Command authorized full humanitarian response under Section 4 of the Compact. Every Terran vessel within 8 hours was directed to converge." Dorith looked around the cargo bay. He looked at the cots and the medics and the children with chocolate on their faces, and the thermal blankets and the Orventhi passengers who were alive, because a secondary circuit board had done the one thing it had been installed to do. "We did not know the signal went to you," he said. "We did not intend it for you." Morrow set down her coffee. "No, sir, you didn't, but the compact says we listen, and the compact says we come, and we did." Dorith was quiet for a long time. The cargo bay moved around them, medics checking vitals, crew distributing blankets, children laughing at a game a human sailor had taught them involving stacking sealed ration packets into towers and seeing whose tower lasted longest. The sound of children laughing in a cargo bay full of survivors was a sound that did not belong to any procedural category Dorith understood, and Thessi watched him not understand it, and she understood it perfectly, because, Laughter was what children did when the floor was right and the hands that held them were steady. "Your compact," Dorothy said finally. "Article 88, I will need to review it." "We'll send you a copy, Admiral." "I would appreciate that. I suspect there are other articles I have not read." Morrow almost smiled. "There usually are, sir." Tessie Renkali sat on a cot in the Resolute's cargo bay with Vale asleep in her lap. The child's claws were retracted. Her breathing was deep and steady and slow, the breathing of a 4-year-old who had decided, at some cellular level, that the surface beneath her was safe and the arms around her were not going to let go. Tessie looked at the ceiling. It was a utilitarian surface, metal panels, conduit runs, lighting strips, the functional architecture of a warship that had been built to fight and was currently being used to hold. It was not beautiful. It was not nacre panels and bioluminescent guide strips and 3 tiers of transparent composite. It was flat gray metal with rivets showing. It was above her. The floor was beneath her. The gravity was correct. The ceiling was where ceilings were supposed to be, and her daughter was asleep, and the chocolate was still on Vale's fingers, and somewhere on the other side of a hull she could not see, human divers were pulling Orventhi children from air pockets in a drowning ship, because a compact that nobody remembered had put them on a frequency that nobody monitored, and someone had been listening anyway. Tessie held her daughter. She looked at the ugly, functional, right-side-up ceiling of a warship that should not be here. And she understood not in the way she understood procedures or transit schedules or grief counselor recommendations, but in the way she understood the weight of a child on her hip and the sound of breathing in the dark, that the ceiling she would remember was this one. Not because it was the one that saved her. Because it was the one that was where it was supposed to be. Old Orn sat on the next cot. His cloth bag was in his lap. He opened it, and Tessie saw what was inside, a small, carved figurine of a sea creature, the kind that Orventhi children received at their naming ceremonies. Old and worn and polished by decades of handling. "My granddaughter's," he said to no one in particular. "She asked me to bring it to her on Kolvari. She's 7. He held it in both hands and looked at the ceiling and said nothing else. A human, a young man in a crew uniform, not a medic, not a rescuer, someone from the ship's regular complement who had come down to the cargo bay on his off-watch to help distribute blankets, stopped beside Orn's cot. He looked at the figurine. He did not ask what it was. He set a cup of warm broth on the edge of the cot and moved on. Tessie watched him go. She watched the way he moved through the cargo bay, unhurried, unremarkable, a person doing a small thing because the small thing was in front of him and he was capable of doing it. She looked at Vale. The child's mouth was slightly open. The chocolate was drying on her fingers. Her claws were retracted. Tessie Renkali was not the kind of person who cried. She held her daughter, and she looked at the ceiling, and she was. 609 survivors, 751 dead. The Maritime Transit Authority's report, published 9 weeks later, would list the cause as navigational buoy failure compounded by insufficient margin recalculation. It would recommend a 17-kilometer increase to the corridor's Varathi Shoals margin. It would note, in a section titled External Assistance, that Terran Combined Fleet Assets had responded under the Interspecies Emergency Compact, Article 88, and had arrived 13 hours and 2 minutes before the Orventhi Maritime Coordination Center's own rescue flotilla. The report would not mention Petty Officer Aaron Wynn, who had heard the signal on a frequency he monitored, because a compact told him to. It would not mention Petty Officer Reese, who had held out empty hands in a flooded corridor and waited. It would not mention the divers from the Pell, who had swum through drowning decks to reach 23 children in a nursery. It would not mention the crew member who had distributed blankets on his off-watch. It would not mention that the signal had gone to the wrong species. It would not mention that the wrong species had come anyway. It would not mention that a 4-year-old girl named Vale Renkali had eaten 2 chocolate bars on a warship and fallen asleep with her claws retracted. Some things did not fit in reports. Some things lived in the space between a signal sent and a signal received, between a frequency monitored and a frequency forgotten, between a ceiling that was wrong and a ceiling that was right. Thessie would remember the ceiling. She would remember it for the rest of her life. Not the one that fell, the one that held,